Ash Hollow sat in the bottom of the valley like the dregs in a coffee cup, bitter and settling hard against the cracked earth. It was the late 80s, a time when the territory was supposed to be civilized. Yet the wind here still carried the scent of dry sage and old blood. The town was wedged between low, jagged hills that looked like the broken teeth of some ancient dead beast. By noon, the sun bleached the color out of everything. The red dirt turned to a blinding white chalk. The gray wood of the boardwalk silvered under the glare, and the sky hardened into a sheet of polished iron that offered no pity and certainly no rain. Dust devils danced down the main street with a chaotic, swirling violence, rattling the windows of the mercantile and coating the throats of men who stood too long outside the saloon. There was a constant, thrumming tension in the air, a vibration that came up through the soles of boots. It was the knowledge that the Apache territory was not so far away as the maps in Washington claimed. It was the resentment that the new railroad line had bypassed the valley by 30 miles, leaving Ash Hollow to slowly choke on its own isolation. The town was barely clinging to survival, much like the dry scrub brush that anchored itself with desperate roots into the hardpan. Clara Hayes moved through this world like a ghost haunting her own life. She was a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, though the sun and the silence had etched a maturity into her face that belonged to someone older. She worked at Mrs. Gable's boarding house, a sprawling, drafty structure near the edge of town where the floors creaked in protest under every footstep. Clara spent her days scrubbing linens in boiling water that reddened her hands, serving meals to transient cattlemen, and sweeping the eternal dust from the porch. She moved with a practiced carefulness, keeping her eyes downcast, always watching the shadows of others before she looked at their faces, even in the height of summer, when the heat was heavy enough to press the breath out of a mule. Clara wore dresses with high collars and long sleeves buttoned tight to her wrists. The townswomen whispered that she was putting on airs of mourning, trying to look pious. They did not know about the scars that mapped the skin of her arms and back, white ridges and puckered burns that she would sooner die than reveal. She was the widow of Luke Barlow. The name Barlow carried weight in Ash Hollow. Heavy as a sack of lead shot, Luke had been the sheriff, a man with a chest full of tin and a heart full of rot. He was the son of Jeremiah Barlow, the cattle baron whose herds grazed the best grass in the valley and whose money built the church where the town prayed for rain. Luke had died 6 months ago in a fall down the rocky slope behind their small house. It was ruled an accident, but the whispers in the general store and the sewing circles told a different story. They said Clara had the look of a woman who knew too much about it. They said she was dangerous. The social prejudice against her was a physical thing, a wall she had to walk around every time she stepped onto the boardwalk. The respectable women of the town pulled their skirts aside when she passed. They whispered that she was tempting, that her silence was a lure, that she was cursed. They guarded their husbands from looking at her too long. For Clara, despite her severe dress and lowered eyes, possessed a beauty that tragedy had not quite managed to erase. It was in the curve of her jaw and the depth of her dark eyes, a kind of bruised elegance that unsettled the righteous. Jeremiah Barlow made sure the town never forgot who Clara belonged to. He used the local preacher, a man with a thin mouth and wet eyes, to keep Clara under a microscope. The sermons often touched on the duty of widows, the sin of independence, and the necessity of obedience to the family patriarch. Jeremiah insisted she live under his moral guidance, which really meant under his thumb. He wanted her obedient, and more than that, he wanted the deed to the small, rocky patch of land her mother had left her years ago. It was worthless land, dry and far from the creek, but Jeremiah Barlow was a man who could not abide anything slipping through his fingers. Clara felt the judgment in every interaction. If she was too quiet, they said she was hiding her guilt. If she smiled at a customer in the boarding house, they said she was hunting for a new man to ruin. She was trapped in a cage made of gossip and memory, pacing the perimeter of her own life. It was into this cauldron of heat and suspicion that Eli Maddox rode one Tuesday afternoon. He came in with a small cattle drive pushing north, a hired hand riding drag at the back of the herd. He was a man who drew the eye not because he was loud, But because he was so profoundly still, Eli was tall and lean, his body honed by years of sleeping on hard ground and waking up ready to fight. His face was weathered like old saddle leather, handsome in a harsh, unforgiving way. But it was the scar that people noticed first. It ran from his left temple, jagged and white, down to the line of his jaw, pulling slightly at the corner of his eye. He rode a roan gelding that looked as mean and tired as he did. As he tied the horse to the rail outside the saloon, the men on the porch stopped their talking. Eli Maddox was mixed blood, half Apache and in Ash Hollow. That was enough to get a man killed if he stepped wrong. The townsfolk called him half savage when they thought he could not hear, and sometimes when they knew he could. He walked into the saloon, the spurs on his boots chiming with a dull, heavy sound. The bartender wiped a rag across the wood and ignored him for a full 2 minutes. Eli did not complain. He did not shift his weight or clear his throat. He simply waited, his dark eyes scanning the room, noting the exits, the drunk miners in the corner, and the shotgun behind the bar. Rumors followed Eli like flies on a fresh carcass. Someone at a poker table murmured that he was a former army scout, one of those who had turned against his mother's people to lead bluecoats into the canyons. Another man whispered that Eli had no soul, that he had killed 3 white men in a bar fight in Tucson over a game of cards. The truth was likely somewhere in the middle, buried under layers of grief and survival that Eli kept locked behind his teeth. He was a man trying to outrun his own history. But history has a way of riding a fast horse. The first time Clara saw him, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks across the western sky. It was supper time at the boarding house. The dining room was crowded with the dust-covered hands from the cattle drive, the air thick with the smell of roasted beef, stale tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Clara moved between the tables with a heavy porcelain coffee pot, filling cups. Eli was sitting alone at a small table in the corner, his back to the wall. He was not eating. He was watching the room with that unnerving, predatory stillness. Clara approached his table, her eyes fixed on the rim of his cup. "Coffee?" she said softly. It was not a question. Eli looked up. His eyes were the color of obsidian, sharp and unreadable. "Please," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder in a box canyon. Clara lifted the pot. As she poured, the heavy door of the boarding house slammed shut behind a late arrival. The sudden bang cracked through the room like a gunshot. Clara flinched violently. The pot jerked in her hand, and hot coffee sloshed over the rim, heading straight for Eli's lap. In a blur of motion, Eli's hand shot out. He didn't jerk away. He caught Clara's wrist, steadying the heavy pot before it could spill further. His grip was firm, his palm rough with calluses, his fingers warm against the pulse that hammered frantically in her wrist. For a second, the room fell away. Clara looked down, and Eli looked up. There was a shock of connection, electric and terrifying, that traveled from his skin to hers. It was not just the surprise of the touch. It was the sensation of being held steady when she was about to fall. She felt a rush of heat flood her face, a sudden, treacherous warmth in her belly that had nothing to do with the stifling room. Then the shame hit her. It crashed down like a bucket of ice water. She heard Luke's voice in her memory, slurring and hateful. "You are weak, Clara. You are tempting them. You want them to look at you, don't you?" She yanked her wrist back as if he had burned her. The coffee pot rattled against the saucer. "I am sorry," she stammered, stepping back, her breath coming short. "I am so clumsy." Eli slowly lowered his hand to the table. He did not mock her. He did not smile the way the other men did when she made a mistake. He just watched her, his expression grave. "No harm done." "Ma'am," he said. Clara turned and fled to the kitchen, her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. She leaned against the cool wood of the pantry door, closing her eyes, waiting for the trembling to stop. She hated her body for its betrayal. She hated that for one singular moment. The touch of a stranger had felt like safety instead of a threat. That night, the shadows of pain came for her, as they always did in the dark. Clara lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind worry the loose shingles on the roof. Sleep was a dangerous country. In the borderlands of her dreams, the memories waited. She saw fragments, sharp and disjointed. She felt the crushing pressure of Luke's hand on her arm, squeezing until the bone ached, leaving bruises in the shape of his fingers. She heard his accusations, born of whiskey and his own inadequacy. "Whore," he would whisper, grabbing her face. "Who were you smiling at?" The smith, the doctor. Then the memory of the end would come. The night on the slope. It had been raining, a rare, violent storm that turned the dust to slick mud. Luke was drunk, raging about a perceived slight in town, dragging her out into the wet dark. He had struck her, a backhanded blow that split her lip. She remembered stumbling back. She remembered the wild, white look in his eyes as he lunged for her again. And then she remembered the sound of boots slipping on wet stone, the sickening crack of bone hitting rock, and the sudden, terrible silence. She remembered standing over him, the rain washing the blood from his temple, and the cold realization that she was glad. That was the sin the town smelled on her. Not that she had killed him. She had not touched him in that final moment, but that she had stood there and watched the life leave him, and felt only a profound, terrifying relief. The next few days brought a tightening of the noose. The cattle drive was resting for a few days before moving on, which meant Eli Maddox was still in town, a dark smudge on the town's conscience. And for Clara, the threats were becoming less subtle. Luke's cousin, Roy Barlow, was a man who had inherited all of the Barlow meanness but none of the money. He worked at the livery stable and spent his wages on cheap whiskey. He blamed Clara for Luke's death, claiming she had driven a good man to his grave with her coldness. Every time Clara walked past the livery, Roy was there. He would lean against the doorframe, spitting tobacco juice near the hem of her skirt. "You owe this family." "Clara," he would sneer, "you think you can just walk around high and mighty? You are nothing without the Barlow name." And then there was Jeremiah. He cornered her in the parlor of the boarding house on Thursday morning. He placed a document on the table, the paper crisp and authoritative. "Sign it, Clara," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "It is for your own protection. A woman alone cannot manage land, the taxes, the upkeep. I will take the burden from you. I do not want to sell." "Jeremiah," Clara said, her voice trembling but her spine straight. "My mother left it to me. It is all I have. You have your reputation," Jeremiah said, his eyes narrowing, "or what is left of it. Do not make me bring this before the judge, girl. If I have to prove you are mentally unfit to hold property, I will do it. And given your history, given the way Luke died, I think the town will believe me." On Sunday, the preacher delivered a sermon that felt like a physical blow. He spoke of the harlot of Babylon, of women who led men astray with their silence and their secrets. He did not say her name, but his eyes lingered on Clara where she sat in the back pew, burning with humiliation. The inciting incident came 2 nights later. The heat had not broken. Even after sunset, the air was thick and still. Clara had stayed late at the boarding house to finish mending a pile of sheets. When she finally stepped out the back door, the town was quiet, save for the distant piano music from the saloon. She needed water for her room. The pump at the boarding house was dry, so she took her bucket and walked to the public pump behind the livery stable. It was a shadowy place, hemmed in by the high wooden walls of the stable and a stack of rotting crates. She pumped the handle, the water splashing cool and loud into the tin bucket. She was just lifting it when a hand grabbed her upper arm. The grip was hard and familiar. Clara gasped, dropping the bucket. Water soaked the hem of her dress. Roy Barlow stepped out of the shadows. He reeked of stale whiskey and unwashed horse. "Well now, Clara," he said, his voice thick. "Look at you, skulking around in the dark, just like a guilty thing. Let me go." "Roy," Clara whispered. Panic seized her throat, closing it off. It was the same panic she felt with Luke, a paralysis that locked her muscles. Roy laughed, a wet, ugly sound. He shoved her back against the rough boards of the stable wall. Splinters bit into her shoulders through her dress. "You think you are too good for us now?" he hissed, pressing his body against hers. "You think you can defy Jeremiah? You need to be taught a lesson. Clara, you need to remember your place." He brought his face close to hers. Clara turned her head, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, waiting for the pain. She could not scream. The sound died in her chest. Then, suddenly, the weight was gone. There was a sound of tearing fabric and a choked grunt. Clara opened her eyes to see Roy flying backward, as if he had been yanked by a rope. He stumbled and fell hard into the dust. Eli Maddox stood between Clara and the fallen man. He did not look like a savior from a storybook. He looked like a shadow that had peeled itself off the wall. He stood loose and relaxed, his hands hanging by his sides, but there was a coiled violence in him that made the air shiver. "Eli," Roy sputtered, scrambling to his feet, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "You dirty half-breed! This is none of your business." Eli took one step forward. Just one, but it was enough to make Roy flinch. "It is my business when a man forces himself on a woman who does not want him," Eli said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It had no anger in it, only a flat, absolute promise of harm. Roy pulled the knife. "You want to die in this alley, boy?" Eli did not draw a gun. He did not even raise his fists. He simply looked at Roy, his dark eyes catching the moonlight. "Put the knife away, Roy, or I will feed it to you." The silence that stretched between them was heavy enough to crush a man. Roy looked at Eli, really looked at him, and saw something in the cowboy's face that sobered him up instantly. He saw the face of a man who had killed before and would not lose a wink of sleep over doing it again. Roy shoved the knife back into its sheath. He spat on the ground, but he backed away. "You do not belong here." "Maddox," he snarled, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "You and your kind. You touch a white woman, you know what happens. I will see you surely hanged for this. And you. Clara, this isn't over." Roy turned and stumbled away into the darkness, his boots scuffing loud and angry against the dirt. Clara stood pressed against the wall, her chest heaving. She was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, sick wash of shame. Eli turned to her. The danger drained out of his posture, leaving him looking tired and gentle. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Clara shook her head, though she wasn't sure. She looked down at her hand. She had scraped her knuckles against the wall when Roy grabbed her. They were bleeding sluggishly. Eli saw it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean, blue bandana. He stepped closer, moving slowly, like one approaches a spooked horse. "Here," he said. He reached out to wrap the cloth around her hand. His fingers brushed the skin of her wrist, right over the pulse point. Clara flinched. It was an instinct, deep and broken. She pulled her hand back sharply, her eyes wide and terrified. Eli froze. He held his hands up, palms open, showing her he held nothing but the cloth. "I am not him, ma'am," he said softly. Clara looked at him. She looked at the scar on his face, the dark depth of his eyes. She felt a sudden, piercing pulse of desire, a longing to step forward into the space he had made, to let that calm strength shield her from the world. It terrified her more than Roy's knife had. She took the bandana from him with shaking fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath. She clutched the cloth to her chest and backed away. She could not stay. She could not let him see how much she wanted to stay. "I have to go," she said. She turned and ran back toward the boarding house, leaving her water bucket in the dust. Eli watched her go. He stood alone in the alley for a long time, listening to the wind rattle the dry leaves. He knew he should leave town. He knew nothing good came from mixing with a woman like her, a woman hunted by her own ghosts. From the shadows across the street, a figure watched them both. A match flared, lighting a cigarette, and the observer smiled a grim, satisfied smile. By morning, the whole town would know that the widow Hayes was meeting the half-breed in the dark alleys. The rumor was already born, hungry and ready to feed. The sun rose over Ash Hollow the next morning with a vengeance, burning away the cool blue of dawn and replacing it with a hard, unforgiving yellow light. It was a light that exposed everything: the peeling paint on the storefronts, the piles of horse manure in the street, and the new, ugly rumors that had sprouted overnight like poisonous toadstools. Clara was in the parlor of the boarding house, sweeping the rug, when the front door burst open. It did not open with the hesitant rattle of a guest. It slammed against the wall with the entitlement of ownership. Jeremiah Barlow stood in the frame. He was a large man, his chest thick like a barrel, his white beard trimmed into a severe spade shape that rested on his stiff collar. He brought the heat of the street in with him, along with the smell of expensive tobacco and judgment. Mrs. Gable, the landlady, scurried out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Barlow," she said, her voice climbing an octave. "We were not expecting you this morning. I am not here for social calls." "Martha," Jeremiah boomed. He looked past her, his eyes locking onto Clara. He marched across the room, his boots thudding heavy on the floorboards. Clara gripped the broom handle until her knuckles turned white. "Good morning, Jeremiah," she said, keeping her voice steady, though her knees felt like water. "Do not speak to me with that false piety." Jeremiah spat. "The news is all over town. Clara, my nephew Roy tells me he found you in the alley behind the livery last night, in the dark, with that mongrel savage from the cattle drive." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "That is a lie," she said, her voice rising. "I went for water. Roy cornered me. He was drunk and he threatened me." "Mister." Maddox stopped him. "That is all." "Stopped him?" Jeremiah let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Roy says you were clinging to the half-breed. He says you looked for all the world like a woman caught in a tryst." "It was an ambush," Clara insisted, looking to Mrs. Gable for support, but the older woman was studying the floor, refusing to meet her eyes. "It was a display of your true nature," Jeremiah said, his voice lowering to a growl. "You have always been wild. Clara, Luke knew it. He tried to tame it out of you, God rest his soul, but I see now he failed. You are shaming this family. You are shaming Luke's memory by cavorting with hired killers in the dirt." "I did nothing wrong," Clara whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Mrs." Gable cleared her throat. "Clara," she said softly, not looking up. "You know I run a respectable house. I cannot have trouble bringing the Barlow wrath down on my door. If there is any more of this disturbance, I will have to ask you to find other arrangements." Clara looked at the woman she had worked for, the woman she had sewn for, and saw the wall of cowardice that fear of the Barlows had built. She realized then, with a sinking heart, that the truth did not matter. Eli saving her did not matter. The town had taken the incident, twisted it, and forged it into a weapon to beat her with. Jeremiah leaned in close, his breath sour. "You are walking a thin line, girl. You will behave, and we will settle the matter of that land soon enough. I will not have Luke's widow living like a stray cat much longer." He turned and marched out, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. The silence he left behind was thick enough to choke on. While Clara was being flayed by words in the parlor, Eli Maddox was finding the town of Ash Hollow had grown teeth overnight. He walked into the mercantile to buy tobacco. The storekeeper, a man who had sold him cartridges the day before with a smile, now turned his back and began rearranging tins of peaches on a high shelf. Eli stood at the counter for 5 minutes. When he finally placed a coin on the wood, the man swept it into a drawer without looking at him, and slid a pouch of tobacco across the counter so hard it fell onto the floor. Eli picked it up slowly. He said nothing. He walked out into the blinding sun. He headed for the saloon, thirsty for a beer to cut the dust. As he stepped through the swinging doors, the conversation in the room died. It was not the usual lull of a stranger entering. It was the sharp, hostile silence of a pack of dogs spotting a wolf. The bartender crossed his arms. "We are out of beer," he said flatly, standing in front of a full keg. Eli looked at him. "Then give me whiskey. Out of that too." "For you." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Someone at a back table muttered, "Go drink from the horse trough. Savage!" Eli felt the old, familiar burn in his gut. It was a mixture of shame and a white-hot anger that tasted like copper. He had scouted for the army. He had saved men's lives in canyons where the sun never touched the bottom. He had ridden through hell and back. And yet here, to these soft men who had never slept without a roof, he was nothing but a half-breed nuisance. He turned to leave, his hand brushing the butt of his pistol. Just a reminder. As he passed a table near the door, a man turned his head and spat. A glob of tobacco spittle landed on the toe of Eli's boot. Eli stopped. The room held its breath. For a second, the violence that lived inside him uncoiled. He could draw. He could put a bullet in that man's knee before the spit dried. He could burn this whole rotten town down to the bedrock. But then he remembered Clara's face in the alley. He remembered the way she had trembled. If he started a fight now, if he killed a man in Ash Hollow, it would only confirm every lie they told about him, and by extension, every lie they told about her. Eli looked down at his boot. Then he looked at the man. Memorizing his face, he shrugged, a small, dismissive movement of his shoulder, and walked out into the street. But as he walked, his jaw was clamped so tight his teeth ached. That afternoon, a shift occurred in the wind, bringing with it the scent of opportunity and danger. A traveling lawyer named Silas Vane had arrived on the morning stagecoach. He was a thin man in a dusty black suit, carrying a leather satchel that looked like it had seen every mile of the territory. He was in the general store, buying a tin of crackers, when he struck up a conversation with the clerk. "It is a shame about the rail line bypassing this valley." "Mr." Vane said, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the store where Jeremiah Barlow was inspecting sacks of grain. "But the company is looking at a spur line, a water stop, mostly. They need a place where the aquifer comes up near the foothills." Jeremiah froze. He turned slowly. "Where in the foothills?" "Mr." Vane adjusted his spectacles. "Oh, just a survey theory for now. But there is a small claim out that way. Belongs to a Hayes family, I believe. The engineers think that specific canyon is the only viable grade for 10 miles. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. He knew the land. It was the worthless scrub patch Clara's mother had left her. He had wanted it simply to consolidate his borders, to wipe out any independence Clara might have. But if the railroad needed it, that worthless dirt was about to become a gold mine. He left the store without buying the grain. An hour later, he found Clara in the vegetable garden behind the boarding house. The sun was beating down on her bonnet as she hoed rows of struggling beans. Jeremiah did not waste time with pleasantries. He pulled a folded sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "Put down the hoe." "Clara." Clara stopped, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her gloved hand. She saw the papers, and her stomach tightened. "I told you, Jeremiah, I am not signing. This is not a request," he said, stepping over a row of wilting lettuce. "I have been patient. I have let you play at being independent. But this alley business proves you are not capable of managing your own affairs. These papers transfer the deed of your mother's land to the Barlow estate. In exchange, I will set up a small trust for you, a stipend, enough to keep you in hats and ribbons." Clara looked at the dense, scrawled handwriting on the pages. "And if I refuse?" Jeremiah smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "If you refuse, I will go to the judge tomorrow. I will have the preacher testify to your moral looseness. I will have Roy testify to your lewd behavior in the alley. And I will have you declared mentally incompetent." "Clara!" A woman driven mad by grief and sin. Clara felt the blood rush in her ears. "You cannot do that." "I can," Jeremiah said softly. "And I will. Who will the town believe? The grieving father of a hero sheriff, or the tainted widow who meets Indians in the dark? You have 2 days. Clara, sign the papers, or I will have you locked away in the asylum in Tucson, and you will never see the sun again." He tossed the papers onto the dirt at her feet and walked away. Clara left the papers in the dirt. She walked, blind and deaf to the world, until she reached the livery stable. She needed to breathe. She needed to be somewhere that smelled of horses and honest work, away from the stench of human greed. She found Eli in the back stall, currying his roan. He was working with a rhythmic, soothing motion, the brush hissing against the horse's coat. Clara stood at the gate of the stall. She was pretending to check on Mrs. Gable's mule, but her hands were empty. "Mr. Maddox," she said. Eli did not jump, but his hand paused. "Mrs. Hayes." It was awkward. The air between them was thick with the memory of the alley and the knowledge of the rumors swirling outside. Clara looked at the scars on the horse's flank. "Mr. Maddox," she started, then stopped. She took a breath. "What happens to men who cross the Barlows?" Eli turned to look at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, tight and controlled. He rested his arm on the horse's back. "In a town like this?" Eli asked. "Yes." Eli thought about it. He did not offer her false comfort. He did not tell her it would be all right. "Some vanish," he said, his voice low and rough. "They ride out and never come back. Some learn to run and keep running until they run out of land." He paused, watching a fly buzz in a sunbeam. "And a few," he added, "stand their ground and bury men, but there are not many of those." Clara shivered. It was a blunt, brutal assessment, yet, strangely, it steadied her. Luke had always lied to her, telling her things were fine while he sharpened his knife. Jeremiah lied with scripture. Eli Maddox told her the truth, even when the truth was a blade. "I want to leave," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I have land, my mother's land. It is days from here, but I cannot go alone, and I have no one." Eli looked at her. He saw the bruises on her soul as clearly as he saw the brand on a steer. He saw a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a wind to push her off. He turned back to his horse, resuming the brushing. "The desert is hard on a woman alone," he said. "It is harder here," Clara replied. The offer came an hour later. The trail boss, a gruff man named Henderson, who wanted to move his herd out before trouble started, found Eli at the blacksmith's. Mr. Vane, the lawyer, was with him. "Maddox," Henderson said, spitting a stream of tobacco. "We are moving out at dawn, but this lawyer here has a proposition." "Mr." Vane stepped forward. "I have business with Mrs. Hayes regarding her property," he said. "She needs to travel to the settlement of Dustford to file her claim properly before Mr. Barlow can file his injunctions. It is a 3-day ride, rough country. She needs an escort." Eli wiped grease from his hands with a rag. "Why come to me?" "Because you are leaving anyway," Henderson said. "And because you are the only man in this town who has not tried to better or rob her." Mr. Vane nodded. "I will pay you $50. Mr. Maddox, half now. Half when she reaches Dustford safely. That is enough to set you up wherever you are going." Eli looked at the money in the lawyer's hand. It was a fortune for a drifter, but that wasn't why he hesitated. He hesitated because he knew that being near Clara Hayes was dangerous, not just because of Barlow, but because of the way his own blood hummed when she was near. He was a man who had sworn off caring for things because things he cared for tended to die. But he thought of Jeremiah Barlow's face. He thought of Clara standing in the stable, asking about men who vanished. "I will do it," Eli said. The choice was not easy for Clara. That evening, the preacher stopped her on the boardwalk. "Sister Clara," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I hear talk that you plan to leave Ash Hollow with that savage. Surely you know that a decent woman does not travel alone with a man like that. If you go, you leave your reputation behind forever. You will be shunned. No righteous door will ever open to you again." Clara looked at the church, the building where she had prayed for Luke to stop drinking, where she had prayed for the bruises to heal. God had never answered her there. Then Jeremiah found her one last time. He did not shout. He spoke through the screen door of the boarding house kitchen. "If you leave, Clara, I will cut you off. You will have nothing, no money, no family name. You will starve in those hills, and the coyotes will pick your bones. And it will be your own doing." Clara went to her room. She sat on her trunk. She remembered the fear in the alley, the smell of whiskey and sweat. She remembered the years of walking on eggshells, the terror of a heavy footstep in the hall. She realized that Jeremiah was right about one thing. She might die in the hills, but if she stayed here, she would surely die. Her soul would wither up and blow away like dust. She packed her trunk. They left an hour before sunrise. The town was a gray silhouette against a dark blue sky, silent and tomb-like. Eli had secured a small buckboard wagon and hitched his roan to it along with a rented mule. Clara climbed up onto the hard wooden seat. She wore a heavy woolen coat over her dress and a bonnet pulled low. She brought only her trunk and a small basket of food. They rolled out of town without a fanfare. The only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of hooves. As they passed the last building, the livery stable, Clara did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the jagged line of the hills waited to swallow them. The first day was a lesson in brutality. The romance of the West died at the edge of town. The land was a vast, indifferent anvil upon which the sun hammered down. They crossed dry creek beds where the earth was cracked in hexagonal patterns like the scales of a giant reptile. They passed the bloated carcass of a steer, legs stiff in the air, buzzing with black flies. The heat rose in shimmering waves, distorting the distance so that the mountains never seemed to get any closer. Clara felt every jolt of the wagon in her spine. The wooden seat was unforgiving. By noon, her back ached with a dull, throbbing constant. By 3 o'clock, she had blisters on her hands from gripping the seat rail, but she did not complain. Not once. When Eli stopped to water the horses from their barrels, she climbed down and helped, her movements stiff but determined. When the dust coated her throat, she swallowed spit and kept her head up. She was terrified that if she showed weakness, Eli would turn the wagon around. They spoke little. The silence of the desert was too big for small talk. "Keep your eyes on the ridge," Eli said once, pointing with his chin. Apache sign was seen there 2 days ago. Clara looked. She saw nothing but rocks and scrub, but she felt the hairs on her arms stand up. Nightfall brought no comfort, only a different kind of hostility. The temperature plummeted as soon as the sun dipped below the earth. The heat evaporated, leaving a piercing, dry cold that sank into the bone. They made camp in the lee of a sandstone overhang. Eli moved with an efficiency that fascinated Clara. He gathered dried sagebrush and buffalo chips, building a small, smokeless fire in a hollow of the ground. He showed her how to make coffee. "You do not boil it," he said. "Setting the pot near the coals, you let it steep. If you boil it, it tastes like battery acid." He showed her how to roll her bedroll, clearing away the stones first, digging a shallow trench for her hips so she wouldn't wake up crippled. Clara sat by the fire, holding a tin cup of coffee with both hands to warm them. The desert at night was alive. Coyotes yipped and howled in the distance, a sound like laughing madmen. The wind moaned through the sagebrush, sounding like voices whispering her name. She looked across the fire at Eli. He was cleaning his rifle, the metal glinting in the firelight. He looked perfectly at home in this emptiness. "Are you afraid of them?" Clara asked softly. "The coyotes?" Eli shook his head. "No, coyotes only sing. It is the things that do not make noise you have to watch for." Clara laid down to sleep, but her mind was a whirlwind. She was out in the open, exposed. The walls of the boarding house were gone. She drifted into a fitful sleep and immediately fell into a nightmare. She was back in the house with Luke. He was shouting, throwing plates. The sound of shattering china was deafening. He lunged for her, his hands reaching for her throat. Clara woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a fist. The desert was silent. The fire had burned down to embers. She looked over. Eli was awake. He was leaning back against his saddle, his hat pulled low, but his eyes were open, watching the darkness. He turned his head and looked at her. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not tell her it was just a dream. He just held her gaze, his presence solid and unmoving. "Go back to sleep." "Clara," he said softly, "I am watching, and for the first time in 6 months, Clara believed that someone actually was. The third night was the coldest yet. The wind had picked up, biting and cruel, carrying grit that stung the skin. They camped in a small wash, trying to stay out of the gale. Clara was shivering violently. She sat by the fire, trying to button her heavy coat, but her fingers were numb with cold and shaking from exhaustion. She fumbled with the top button, missing the hole again and again. A tear of frustration leaked from her eye. Eli watched her from across the fire. He set down his coffee cup and stood up. He walked around the fire and crouched in front of her. "Let me," he said. Clara froze. He was close. She could smell the smoke on his clothes, the scent of horse and leather. Eli reached out. His hands were large, scarred, and rough, but his movements were surprisingly deft. He caught the button and slipped it through the hole. He moved down to the next one. Clara held her breath. She watched his face, the concentration in his dark eyes. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. As he fastened the third button, right over her heart, the back of his knuckles grazed the swell of her breast through the thick wool. It was an accident, a meaningless brush of skin against fabric, but to Clara, it felt like a lightning strike. They both froze. Eli's hand stopped. He did not pull away instantly. He paused, his knuckles resting against her coat. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. A flood of memory crashed into her. Luke's rough, demanding hands, the pain, the humiliation. But crashing against that wave was something new. A hunger, a desperate, terrified need for this man's warmth. She looked at his face and saw the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't looking at her like a piece of property. He was looking at her like she was terrifyingly precious. "Please," she whispered. The word hung in the air. "Don't," she added. But the tone was wrong. It wasn't a rejection. It was a plea. It was a confused, broken sound that meant, "I am afraid, and I want you all at once." Eli snatched his hand back as if the coat were red-hot iron. He stood up abruptly, backing away 2 steps. "I apologize," he said, his voice rough. "I did not mean to. I was just helping with the buttons." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, trembling. "I know," she said. "I know." Eli turned his back to her, staring out into the dark. "I will not touch you, Clara," he vowed, his voice fierce and low. "Not unless you ask me to. You have my word." He walked to the edge of the light, putting distance between them, patrolling a perimeter that didn't need patrolling. Clara lay down in her bedroll. She pulled the blankets up to her chin. She was still shaking, but it wasn't just from the cold anymore. She closed her eyes and realized, with a shock that rocked her to her core, that when his hand had brushed her chest, her first instinct hadn't been to push him away. Her first instinct had been to lean forward. She had wanted him to keep buttoning the coat. She had wanted him to pull her into the fire's warmth and hold her until the shaking stopped. She lay under the vast, uncaring stars, terrified of the bandits in the hills, but even more terrified of the treacherous longing waking up inside her own heart. The land changed as they pushed further west, shedding the familiar, flat scrub of the valley for a landscape that felt older and more hostile. The earth turned the color of dried blood, rising in jagged formations that tore at the belly of the sky. They entered a maze of canyons where the sun only reached the bottom for a few hours at midday, leaving them in a long, cool twilight for the rest of the ride. The wagon rattled violently over the uneven ground. Clara Hayes gripped the wooden seat with hands that had grown calloused over the last few days. Her knuckles were white. Above them, the canyon walls rose 300 feet, sheer and unforgiving. Every half-mile, a loose rock would clatter down from the heights, striking the canyon floor with a sound like a pistol shot, making the horses shy and dance in their traces. Eli Maddox drove with a loose stillness, his eyes constantly scanning the rim of the canyon. He did not speak much. He seemed to have merged with the country, his silence a part of the stone and the dust. Clara watched him when she thought he was not looking. She watched the way his hands handled the leather reins, firm but gentle. coaxing the team through narrow gaps where the wheels scraped against the sandstone. On the second afternoon in the Red Country, the wind died, which Eli said was a bad sign. An hour later, the sky to the west turned a bruised purple, and the air grew heavy and electric. "Cover your face," Eli ordered, pulling the horses to a halt in the lee of a large boulder. Before Clara could ask why, the wall of dust hit them. It did not come like rain. It came like a solid thing, a roaring brown wave that swallowed the world. Eli pulled Clara down from the seat, dragging her under the shelter of the wagon bed. He threw a heavy canvas tarp over them, pinning the edges down with his own weight. For 2 hours, the world was nothing but wind and grit. The dust tasted like copper in Clara's mouth. It coated her eyelashes, filled her nose, and worked its way through the layers of her clothing. They lay huddled together in the dark beneath the wagon, the roar of the storm drowning out any attempt at speech. Clara could feel the heat of Eli's arm pressed against hers. In the terrifying dark, with the wind howling like a banshee, that contact was the only thing that felt real. When the wind finally died, they crawled out into a transformed world. The canyon was silent. Drifts of fine red sand were piled against the wagon wheels. The sun was setting, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. They made a cold camp that night, too exhausted to hunt for wood. The sky, scrubbed clean by the storm, was a vast, terrifying dome of stars. There were so many of them, hanging so low, that Clara felt she could reach up and cut her fingers on them. It made her feel incredibly small, a speck of dust on a rock hurtling through the dark. "I feel as though we have fallen off the edge of the map," Clara whispered, breaking the silence. Eli handed her a piece of hardtack and dried beef. "The map is in your head. Clara, we are just walking across the ground." The next day brought them to the Devil's Throat, a narrow pass where the trail pinched tight between two massive outcroppings of granite. It was the only way through to the lower plains that led to the railroad. As the wagon creaked around the bend, Eli suddenly pulled back on the reins. "Whoa," he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. Clara looked up. 2 men were sitting on horses in the middle of the trail, blocking the way. They were rough-looking men, wearing long dusters that hid their belts. Their hats were pulled low, and they did not move as the wagon approached. "Morning, folks," the one on the left said. He had a thick black mustache and a smile that showed too many teeth. "This is a toll road. New county ordinance." Eli sat relaxed on the bench, but Clara noticed that his right hand had drifted casually to his thigh, near the flap of his holster. "I have ridden this trail for 10 years, Eli said, his voice flat. "There is no county here, and there is no toll." The man's smile widened, but his eyes remained dead. "Well, things change. Partner, we are deputies, just collecting for the sheriff. Show me a badge," Eli said. The second man, who had been silent, shifted his horse. "We do not need to show you anything. Boy, now step down from the wagon. We need to inspect your cargo." "And the lady?" Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She recognized the tone. It was the same tone Luke used to have when he was looking for a fight, the same predatory slide in the voice that meant violence was coming. Eli did not look at Clara. He did not look at the horses. He looked straight at the man with the mustache. "Ride aside," Eli said. "I will not ask you twice." The man on the left laughed. "You are a bold one for a half-breed. I think I will just take—" The man moved his hand toward his coat. The violence happened so fast that Clara's mind could barely track it. 1 second. Eli was sitting still. The next, there was a deafening crack of thunder right beside her ear. Smoke bloomed from the barrel of Eli's Colt Peacemaker. The man with the mustache jerked backward in his saddle as if he had been kicked by a mule. A red blossom exploded on his chest. He tumbled from his horse, hitting the dust with a heavy, final thud. The second man, seeing his partner fall, panicked. He fumbled for his own gun, but Eli had already cocked the hammer back. The dark muzzle of the pistol was aimed squarely at the second man's face. "Go," Eli said. The word was not a shout. It was a command spoken with the absolute certainty of death. The second man went pale. He wheeled his horse around, digging his spurs into the animal's flanks, and galloped back through the pass, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Silence rushed back into the canyon, broken only by the snorting of the wagon team and the ringing in Clara's ears. She looked at Eli. His face was blank. It was not angry, nor fearful, nor triumphant. It was simply empty, a mask of cold efficiency. He lowered the hammer of his gun and holstered it in one fluid motion, then looked down at the body in the dirt to ensure the threat was ended. Clara stared at the dead man. He lay twisted, his eyes staring up at the blue strip of sky. Eli turned to her. "Are you hit?" he asked. Clara shook her head. She could not speak. She was trembling, a deep vibration that started in her bones. She looked at Eli, and for the first time, she saw the killer the town whispered about. She saw the army scout who had led soldiers into battle. It terrified her, and yet, beneath the terror, there was a profound, confusing sense of awe. He had killed to keep them from touching her. He had become a monster so that she did not have to be a victim. "We have to keep moving," Eli said, gathering the reins. His partner might bring friends. He slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, forcing the horses to step carefully around the corpse in the road. Clara squeezed her eyes shut as they passed it, but she could not block out the image of the blood soaking into the thirsty earth. They rode hard for another hour before Eli found a defensible spot near a dry creek bed to stop and rest the horses. He helped Clara down from the seat. As her feet touched the ground, her knees buckled. The shock caught up with her all at once. The world tilted, gray spots swimming in her vision. Eli caught her. His arms were hard and steady, holding her upright. He walked her over to a flat rock and sat her down, then brought her a canteen. "Drink," he said gently. Clara took a sip, the water cool against her parched throat. She looked at her hands. They were shaking so badly she spilled water down her chin. "I have seen a man die before," she whispered. The words came out unbidden, a confession she had not planned to make. Eli crouched in front of her, eye level. "I know," he said. Clara looked at him, her eyes wide and haunted. "Not like that," she said. "With Luke, on the slope. I was so angry. He was hurting me. He was drunk, and he slipped. But Eli—" She paused, her breath hitching. "I do not know if I pushed him. I remember his hands on me. I remember shoving him away. And then he was falling. I have lived every day since wondering if I am a murderer." She waited for him to pull away. She waited for the judgment that she saw in the eyes of the townsfolk of Ash Hollow. Eli did not flinch. He reached out and took the canteen from her shaking hands, capping it. "Clara," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting. "You were fighting a man who meant you harm. It does not matter if he slipped or if you pushed him. You were trying to survive. That is enough. The world is full of dead men who thought they had the right to hurt someone. You are alive. Do not apologize for it." Clara looked at him, tears spilling over her lashes. His absolution washed over her, cleaner than the water. He did not offer her false piety. He offered her the harsh, simple truth of the frontier. Survival was the only morality that mattered out here. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli stood up, his face closing off again, becoming the mask of the protector. "Rest a moment more. Then we ride." 2 days later, they descended from the high country into the basin that held the town of Dustford. If Ash Hollow was dying, Dustford was ugly and alive. It was a railhead town, a place where iron tracks met cattle trails. The buildings were raw timber, hastily constructed and unpainted. The streets were a churning sea of mud and manure, crowded with freight wagons, railroad workers, drifters, and cattlemen. The air smelled of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and money-changing hands. Eli guided the wagon down the main thoroughfare. The noise was overwhelming after the silence of the canyons. Pianos tinkled from 3 different saloons. Men shouted and cursed. A steam whistle shrieked from the depot. People stopped to stare as they passed. In Ash Hollow, the stares had been full of judgment. Here, they were full of speculation. Men on the boardwalks looked at Clara with open, hungry eyes. They saw a woman traveling with a mixed-blood cowboy, dust on her clothes, and they made the only assumption a town like Dustford knew how to make. "That is a fine-looking dove," a man shouted from a balcony, pointing a bottle at Clara. "How much for an hour, sweetheart?" Clara shrank into her coat, pulling her bonnet lower. She felt dirty, exposed. Eli's jaw tightened, but he kept the horses moving. "Ignore them," he said under his breath. "We are going to the hotel." They pulled up in front of the Drovers' Hotel, the only establishment that looked like it had a roof that didn't leak. Eli tied the team and helped Clara down. He took her arm, his grip firm, guiding her through the crowded lobby to the front desk. The clerk was a thin man with greasy hair and a suit that was shiny at the elbows. He looked at Eli, taking in the dust, the scar, and the gun on his hip. Then he looked at Clara. "We need a room," Eli said. The clerk sniffed. "We do not rent to companions. This is a respectable establishment." Eli leaned over the counter. The clerk leaned back. "This is my wife," Eli said. His voice was loud enough for the people in the lobby to hear. "Mrs. Maddox is tired from the journey. We want a room. One room." The clerk blinked. He looked from Eli to Clara. Clara felt the blood rush to her face. She felt the eyes of the lobby pressing against her back. She knew she should be scandalized, but she also knew that without this lie, they would be sleeping in the street. She forced herself to stand tall. She placed her hand on Eli's arm. "Please," she said to the clerk. "My husband is weary." The clerk hesitated, then grunted. "Room 204, $2 a night in advance." Eli slapped $2 silver on the counter. The room was small, smelling of stale cigar smoke and lye soap. It had a single window that looked out over the alley, a wash basin with a cracked pitcher, and a narrow iron bed with a thin quilt. There was one rickety chair in the corner. Eli locked the door behind them and slid the bolt home. The sound was final. They were alone. The forced intimacy of the space was sudden and suffocating. For days, they had the open sky. Now, they were enclosed in a box 10 feet square. "I will sleep on the floor," Eli said, moving to take the blanket from the bed. "No," Clara said. Eli stopped. "Clara, it is not proper. You are hurt," she said. She had seen him favoring his side earlier, where he had bruised his ribs during the rough ride through the canyon. "And the floor is drafty boards. We have lived in the dirt for a week. Eli, I will not have you freezing on the floor while I sleep on a mattress." "But we are fully clothed," she interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "And we are married, according to the register." She turned away to take off her bonnet, hiding her flushed face. That night was an agony of silence. They lay on the narrow bed, Clara against the wall, Eli on the edge. They lay back to back, fully dressed, boots off. The mattress sagged in the middle, conspiring to pull them together. Clara could feel the heat radiating from Eli's back. It seeped through her dress, warming her skin. She lay with her eyes open, staring at the peeling wallpaper. Her mind raced. She remembered lying like this with Luke, her body tense, waiting for him to turn over, waiting for the smell of whiskey and the rough, selfish groping that he called love. She had learned to hate the bed. She had learned to make herself small and cold. But now, lying next to Eli, her body was betraying her again. She did not feel cold. She felt a strange, heavy longing. She wanted to turn over. She wanted to press her back against his, to borrow his strength. She wanted to know what it felt like to be held by a man who had killed to protect her, not to own her. Eli lay rigid as a board. He held his arms tight against his chest, his breathing shallow and controlled. He was terrified that if he moved, he would brush against her. He was terrified that she would feel the tension in his muscles and think he was a beast. He prayed for sleep, but sleep was miles away. In the middle of the night, the wind picked up again. A sudden violent gust slammed into the side of the hotel. The wooden shutter on the window, which had been unlatched, banged open and slammed against the outside wall with a crack like a gunshot. Clara screamed. It was a raw, instinctive sound. In her half-sleep, she was back in the house, and Luke had just kicked open the bedroom door. She scrambled backward, flailing, and collided with Eli. She clutched at his shirt, burying her face in his chest, her fingers digging into his shoulders. No, she sobbed. No, please. Eli reacted instantly. He did not pull away. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, shielding her body with his own. Clara, he murmured, his voice rumbling against her ear. It is the wind, just the wind. You are safe. I am here. Clara shook violently, her tears soaking the front of his shirt. She clung to him, gasping for air. The smell of him, dust and soap and man, filled her senses, chasing away the phantom smell of whiskey. She realized where she was. She realized she was in Eli's arms, her legs tangled with his, her face pressed to his heart, and she did not let go. I am afraid, she whispered into the dark. Her voice was broken. I know, Eli said, stroking her hair with a hesitant, clumsy gentleness. The nightmare is gone. No, she said, pulling back just enough to look at his face in the gloom. I am not afraid of the dream. I am afraid of this. She moved her hand to rest over his heart. I am afraid of wanting you. Eli, I am afraid of what it means. With Luke, wanting meant being hurt. It meant being used until there was nothing left of me. I am afraid that if I want you, I will lose myself again. Eli went still. Her words cut him deeper than any bullet could. He looked down at her, seeing the terror and the desire warring in her eyes. He felt his own hunger rising, a fierce, desperate need to kiss the fear out of her, to show her that a man's hands could give instead of take. But he held back. He would die before he became another shadow in her life. Clara, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Wanting is not a sin. It is just being human. But listen to me. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. I will never hurt you. I will never take anything from you that you do not freely give. You are not property. You are Clara, and you are safe with me, even from me. Clara looked at him, searching his face. She saw the restraint, the cost of it etched in the lines of his mouth. She saw a man who was fighting his own nature to honor hers. She closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against his chin. Thank you. She breathed. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the line between protector and lover blurring, but never crossing. The morning brought the harsh light of reality. Eli went out early to find the lawyer, Silas Vane, who was supposed to meet them in Dustford. Clara stayed in the room, washing her face, trying to scrub away the confusion of the night. When Eli returned an hour later, his face was grim. He was not alone. Silas Vane followed him into the room, looking pale and nervous. Mrs. Hayes, Vane said, removing his hat. We have a problem. A serious one. What is it? Clara asked. Standing up, Vane pulled a document from his satchel. Jeremiah Barlow has been busy. He sent a rider ahead of us. He has filed a petition with the circuit court here in Dustford. He handed the paper to Clara. She read it, her hands beginning to tremble. It was a legal motion declaring Clara Hayes morally depraved and mentally unstable. It claimed she had fled Ash Hollow to live in sin with a known criminal. It petitioned the court to place her and her assets under the conservatorship of Jeremiah Barlow. There are affidavits here, Vane said quietly. Forged. Of course. Signatures from people in Ash Hollow claiming they saw you, doing things. And the sheriff here in Dustford? He is an old friend of Jeremiah's. He has already signed a warrant for your detention pending a hearing. If I go to the courthouse? Clara asked. You will be arrested, Vane said, and the judge will almost certainly grant Jeremiah's petition. If you walk into that court with Mr. Maddox beside you, you prove their case. They will point to him and say, See, she is with the savage. Clara dropped the paper. It fluttered to the floor like a dying bird. It is a trap. Eli walked to the window and looked out at the street. He stood there for a long time, his back to the room. There is only one way, Eli said. He turned around. The mask was back in place, the cold, efficient look he had worn after shooting the bandit. I have to leave. Clara. Clara felt the air leave the room. "What? I am the evidence," Eli said. "I am the reason they can call you ruined. If I am gone, if you walk into that court with a respectable escort, their argument falls apart." He looked at Vane. "Can you find someone else? Someone the town will not spit on?" Vane nodded slowly. "There is a wagon master, Mr. Henderson. He is elderly, religious, a deacon. If he escorts her the rest of the way to the land office, it would look proper." "No," Clara said. Her voice was sharp. "No. Eli, you cannot just leave me. I have to," Eli said. He walked over to her. He did not touch her. He kept his hands at his sides, fists clenched. "It is the only way you keep your land. It is the only way you get free of Barlow. As long as I am standing next to you, you are painted with my brush." He looked at her with an intensity that burned. "You deserve a life. Clara, a clean life. Not a life of running and hiding with a man like me." Clara looked at him. She saw the logic. It was cruel, iron-hard logic. But she also saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that he wasn't good enough, that he was poisoning her life just by being in it. "I do not care about what they say," Clara said. "You will," Eli said softly. "When you are starving. When they take your freedom." He turned to the door. "I will go make the arrangements with Henderson. Stay inside." He walked out. Clara stood in the middle of the room. The silence rushed back in, deafening and heavy. She looked at the unmade bed where they had held each other only hours before. She looked at the wash basin. She looked at the locked door. She felt a cracking sensation in her chest, as if her heart were physically breaking. She had spent years building walls to keep men out. She had finally let one in. Just a little. And now he was leaving to save her. She sank down onto the edge of the bed. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to recreate the feeling of his embrace. But the room was empty and cold. "Hold me like you mean it," she whispered to the empty air. "Just once." The words hung in the silence, unanswered. When Eli returned an hour later, he did not look at her. He began packing his saddlebags with jerky movements. The air between them was thick with unsaid words, heavy with a grief that had not yet found a name. They moved around each other like ghosts, preparing for a separation that felt like a death. The morning light that filtered into room 204 was gray and lifeless, carrying the chill of the high desert. Clara woke slowly, reaching out instinctively across the mattress. Her hand met only cold cotton. She sat up, her heart giving a strange, hollow thump against her ribs. The room was silent, the space where Eli had slept, rigidly separate from her only hours before, was empty. His saddlebags were gone. His rifle was gone. On the small, scarred table near the wash basin, there was a neat stack of coins, $50, she guessed, and a scrap of paper torn from a ledger. Clara swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. She walked to the table, her hands trembling as she picked up the note. The handwriting was jagged and heavy, the script of a man who held a pen like a knife. "You deserve a quiet life. The shadows follow me." Clara stared at the words until they blurred. He had done exactly what he said he would do. He had cut the infection out to save the patient. It was a noble, selfless, and utterly cruel act. She crumbled the paper in her fist, feeling a hot tear track down her cheek. He had left her, after the canyon, after the night in the dark with the wind howling. He had decided she was better off alone. A heavy knock at the door made her jump. "Mrs. Hayes," a gruff voice called out. "I am Mr. Henderson. Silas Vane sent me." Clara wiped her face hastily with her sleeve. She unlocked the door. Mr. Henderson was a man built like a block of granite, with a face that looked as though it had never smiled. He wore a stiff Sunday coat and held a hat that looked like it cost more than Clara's entire trunk. He looked past her into the room, his eyes scanning for any sign of impropriety. "Mr. Vane says you are ready to travel," Henderson said. His voice was flat, devoid of the rough warmth Eli's had carried. "I have the wagon out front. We leave in 20 minutes. I do not wait for tardiness." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She packed her trunk in silence. the room feeling vast and suffocating without Eli's quiet presence filling the corners. The journey with Mr. Henderson was a lesson in isolation. He did not let her sit on the buckboard seat next to him. He claimed the bench was too narrow, but Clara knew it was because he did not want his sleeve brushing against a woman of her reputation. She sat in the back of the wagon, jostled among the crates of supplies, watching the dust curl up from the wheels. Henderson did not speak to her of the landscape or the weather. When they stopped to water the horses, he treated her with a chilled, distant courtesy, like one might treat a stranger with a contagious disease. On the second day, they stopped at a small settlement called Crossing Creek to repair a wheel rim. It was hardly a town, just a general store, a telegraph office, and a blacksmith. Clara walked toward the store to buy a vival of water, her head down. As she passed two women shaking out rugs on a porch, the conversation stopped abruptly. "That is her," one whispered, not bothering to lower her voice much. "The one from the wire. The one running with the half-breed. Damaged goods." The other replied with a sniff. "Shameful." Clara kept walking, her face burning. The telegraph lines, strung like spider webs across the territory, had carried Jeremiah Barlow's poison faster than any horse could run. She was no longer Clara Hayes, widow. She was a scandal, a headline, a warning to other women. When she returned to the wagon, Henderson was talking to a man on a horse. The rider wore a tin star pinned to his dust-coated vest. It was a deputy, but not from Crossing Creek. Clara recognized the horse's brand. It was a Barbie mount, Jeremiah Barlow's stock. The deputy turned as Clara approached. He was a young man with a face pitted by smallpox and eyes that slid over her like greasy oil. "Clara Hayes?" the deputy asked, smiling a smile that made Clara's skin crawl. "Yes," Clara said, gripping her skirts. "I have a warrant for your return to Ash Hollow," the deputy said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "Stolen property, and a petition for competency hearing. You are coming with me." Clara turned to Henderson. "Mr. Henderson, please, this is a lie." "You know, mister, Vane hired you to take me to my land." Henderson looked at the deputy's gun, then at the warrant. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "I want no trouble with the law, ma'am. I was paid to haul a passenger, not a fugitive. If the law wants you, the law takes you." "But he is lying," Clara cried, stepping back. The deputy dismounted and grabbed her wrist. His grip was not gentle. It was possessive. "Do not make a scene, darling. You have caused enough trouble. Jeremiah wants you back, and what Jeremiah wants, he gets—" He pulled a length of rough hemp rope from his saddle horn. Clara fought, twisting her arm, but she was no match for him. He bound her wrists in front of her, tying the knot tight enough to pinch the skin. "Get on the horse," the deputy ordered, gesturing to a spare mount he was leading. Clara looked at Henderson one last time. The older man was already climbing back onto his wagon, refusing to meet her eyes. He was a good, God-fearing man, and he was leaving her to the wolves because it was the easy thing to do. Clara mounted the horse, humiliated tears blurring her vision, as the deputy led her away, back toward the east, back toward the cage Jeremiah had built for her. She felt a crushing weight of despair. She was small. She was nothing against the machinery of power that men like Barlow controlled. Eli was gone, and this time, there was no one in the shadows to catch her. Eli Maddox was camped 20 miles to the north, in a tangle of rocky hills where the wind whistled through the crevices like a dying breath. He had pushed his horse hard after leaving Dusford, trying to put distance between himself and the pain in his chest. He told himself he had done the right thing. He told himself that Clara was safe now, traveling with a deacon, heading toward a new life where her name wouldn't be stained by his. But the silence of the camp was accusing. He lay by his small fire, staring up at the stars. Sleep came in fits and starts, bringing with it the old nightmares. He was back in the Dragoon Mountains. Years ago, he was scouting for the cavalry. There was a village burning. He saw a woman running, carrying a child. He shouted at the soldiers to hold their fire, but the roar of the carbines drowned him out. He saw the woman fall. He saw the dust puff up around her. He felt the crushing, suffocating weight of guilt, that his skill, his tracking, had led death right to her door. Eli woke with a gasp, sweating despite the cold. He sat up, raking his hands through his hair. "It is better this way," he whispered to the fire. "She is safe from me." Morning broke with a slate-gray sky that promised snow. Eli was saddling the roan when he heard the clatter of hooves on stone. A lone rider was picking his way down the trail, a prospector by the look of his mule. Eli stood still, his hand resting near his gun, watching. The prospector raised a hand in greeting. "Morning? Coffee hot?" Eli poured the man a cup. They stood in the uncomfortable silence of the frontier, blowing on the steam. "Heading to Dustford?" the prospector asked. "Leaving it," Eli said. "Smart man. Place is buzzing like a kicked hive. Saw a commotion just this morning down at Crossing Creek. Some deputy from the valley dragging a woman back west, tied up like a horse thief." Eli went still. The coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. "What woman?" The prospector shrugged. "Young thing, dark hair, looked scared out of her wits. Heard the deputy say something about her stealing from the Barlow estate. They were riding hard, trying to beat the weather." The cup dropped from Eli's hand. It hit a rock and spilled the dark liquid into the dust. Eli did not say a word. He turned and threw his saddle onto the roan. He cinched the girth with a violence that made the horse grunt. "You all right, mister?" the prospector asked, backing away. Eli swung into the saddle. His face was a mask of terrifying calm, but his eyes were burning with a cold. "Blue fire. I made a mistake," Eli said. He wheeled the horse around and kicked it into a gallop, not caring about the loose shale or the treacherous footing. He had tried to be noble. He had tried to walk away to save her, and all he had done was hand her over to the very monsters he had sworn to protect her from. The wind whipped his coat around him, stinging his eyes, echoing the turmoil in his gut. He had left her. He had abandoned her to men who saw her as a thing to be broken. If they touched her, if that deputy hurt her, Eli knew with a dark certainty that he would not just kill the man. He would take him apart. He rode like a man possessed, tracking the deputy's route not by sign, but by the burning instinct that pulled him toward her. He decided then, as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the leaden sky, that he was done running from his shadows. If he died standing between Clara and the world, then that was a death worth dying. It was dusk when he caught them. The deputy had made camp in a shallow depression near the edge of the timberline, trying to find shelter from the rising wind. A small fire sputtered against the coming storm. Clara was sitting on a log, her hands still bound, her head bowed in exhaustion. The deputy was standing by the fire, warming his hands and laughing at something he had just said. Eli did not ride in with guns blazing. That was a good way to get a hostage killed. He tied his horse a quarter-mile back and moved through the brush on foot. He moved like the Apache scout he had been, silent as smoke, placing his feet with a deliberate softness that made no sound on the frozen earth. He circled the camp, coming up behind the deputy. He could hear the man's voice now. "Jeremiah will have you singing hymns by Sunday. Clara, once he gets you back in that house, you won't have time to be thinking about your cowboy." Clara did not look up. She just stared at the fire, shivering. Eli stepped out of the darkness. He did not draw his gun. He did not need to. "Get away from her," Eli said. The deputy spun around, his hand clawing for his holster, but he was slow, clumsy with cold and surprise. Eli covered the distance in 2 long strides. He caught the deputy's wrist before the gun cleared leather, twisting it sharply upward. There was a sickening pop of cartilage. The deputy screamed, dropping the gun. Eli didn't stop. He drove his fist into the man's stomach, doubling him over, then brought his elbow down hard on the back of the deputy's neck. The man collapsed into the dirt, wheezing, clutching his broken wrist. Eli kicked the pistol away into the darkness. He stood over the groaning man, his chest heaving, his face hard. "I should kill you," Eli said. The wind snatched the words from his mouth. "Eli!" The scream broke through his rage. He turned. Clara was standing, stumbling toward him with her hands tied. Eli went to her. He pulled a knife from his belt, not to fight, but to slash the ropes binding her wrists. As soon as her hands were free, Clara swung. She slapped him. It was a hard, stinging blow across his cheek, fueled by days of terror and the agony of his abandonment. "You left me!" she cried, her voice cracking. "You left me alone!" Eli did not flinch. He took the blow. He deserved it. "I know," he said roughly. "I know." Then Clara crumbled. The anger vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by a desperate, overwhelming relief. She threw herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face in his coat. She clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving. "I thought I would never see you again." She sobbed against his chest. "I am here," Eli murmured, wrapping his arms around her, crushing her to him. "I am here." "I will not leave again. I swear it." He looked over Clara's head at the deputy, who was trying to crawl toward his horse. "Leave the horse," Eli barked. "Start walking." The deputy froze. "In this weather? I will freeze." "Then start walking fast," Eli said. "Tell Jeremiah Barlow that if he sends another man for her, I will send him back in a box." The deputy scrambled up, cradling his wrist, and stumbled off into the dark, vanishing into the brush. Eli turned back to Clara. He brushed the hair from her face. Her skin was ice cold. The snow was falling harder now, thick white flakes that stuck to her lashes. "We cannot stay here," Eli said. "He will find help, and this storm is turning bad." "Where do we go?" Clara asked, her teeth chattering. "Up," Eli said, looking toward the looming black shapes of the mountains. "They will stick to the road. We have to go where they cannot follow." They rode double on Eli's strong roan, leaving the deputy's horse to wander and confuse the trail. They turned off the main track, heading straight up into the steep, pine-covered slopes. The storm descended with a fury. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, whipping the snow into blinding sheets of white. The temperature dropped until the air burned the lungs. Clara sat behind Eli, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her face pressed into his back. She could feel him shivering too, though he tried to hide it. The horse struggled through the deepening drifts, its breathing loud and labored. "We have to find shelter," Eli shouted over the wind. He was navigating by memory and instinct now. He remembered an old line cabin from his scouting days, a shack built for cattlemen checking fence lines in the high summer pastures. It should be near the ridge. They found it just as the horse was beginning to stumble. It was a dark, squat shape, half buried in a drift, barely visible through the swirling snow. Eli slid off the horse and pulled Clara down. Her legs were so numb she couldn't stand. She collapsed into the snow. Eli scooped her up, carrying her through the waist-deep drift to the door. He kicked the ice away from the jam and shoved the door open. It groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, it was pitch black and freezing, but the wind stopped. Eli set Clara down on the floor and quickly brought in his saddlebags and the bedroll. He led the horse into the lee of the cabin wall, rigging a makeshift shelter with a tarp, knowing the animal was their only ticket out. He came back inside and barred the door. Clara was huddled in the corner, shaking violently. Her lips were blue. Hypothermia was setting in. Eli moved with frantic haste. He found the stone hearth. It was cold as a tomb. He smashed a rotting chair leg for kindling and used his last dry matches. His hands shook so badly he wasted two before a flame finally sputtered to life. He fed the fire, nursing it until it roared, casting a flickering orange light over the small, dirty room. The cabin smelled of rats and old pine, but to Clara, it smelled like salvation. She watched Eli. He was bleeding. His knuckles were raw from the fight, and the cold had cracked the skin on his fingers. "Your hands," Clara whispered. Eli looked at them as if he didn't recognize them. "It is nothing." Clara crawled toward him. She took his hands in hers. They were ice cold. She began to chafe them, rubbing the circulation back into the stiff fingers. "Let me," she said. He did not pull away this time. He sat heavily on the floor, leaning back against the rough log wall. Clara sat in front of him, holding his hands, blowing warm breath onto his knuckles. Outside, the storm raged, burying the world in white. Inside, the fire popped and hissed. The proximity was intense. There was no space here for modesty or lies. They were two people stripped down to the bone by the cold and the fear. Eli looked at Clara. The firelight danced in her dark hair. She looked exhausted, bruised, and terrified. But she was tending to him. "Why did you come back?" Clara asked softly, not looking up from his hands. "Because I was wrong," Eli said. His voice was rough. "I thought I could save you by leaving. I thought I was the danger. But when I heard they had you, when I imagined you in that cell," he closed his eyes, "I realized that the worst thing that could happen to you wasn't the gossip. It was being alone." Clara stopped rubbing his hands. She looked up at him. "Luke never left me alone," she said quietly. "He was always there, watching. But I was the loneliest person in the world." She took a breath, the confession spilling out. "He was charming, at first. Everyone says that. But he brought me flowers. He danced with me. But then, it was like a slow poison. He started telling me what to wear, who to speak to. Then came the bruises. He always hit me where the dress would cover it." She looked down at Eli's scarred hands. "The night he died, I told you I didn't know if I pushed him. But Eli, I remember thinking it. I remember seeing him slip on the wet rock, seeing his arms flail. And for a split second, I didn't reach out. I could have grabbed his coat. I could have tried, but I didn't. I let him fall." She looked at Eli, expecting horror. "I wanted him dead. Does that make me a monster?" Eli turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. His grip was strong and warm. "No," he said, "it makes you human." He looked into the fire. "I was a scout for the 3rd Cavalry. My job was to find the Apache bands hiding in the canyons. My mother's people. I told myself I was bringing peace. I told myself if I brought the soldiers, the bands would surrender and go to the reservation. I thought I was saving them from starvation." His face twisted with an old pain. "We found a village in the dragoons. I gave the signal, but the captain didn't want to surrender. He wanted a body count. They rode in shooting. Women, children. I stood there and watched. I had a rifle in my hand. Clara, I could have shot the captain. I could have done something. But I froze. I watched them die because I was afraid of the court-martial." He looked back at her, his eyes wet. "I carry their ghosts. Every day. I do not deserve a woman like you. I do not deserve to be happy." Clara reached out. She placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the steady, strong thudding beneath the heavy coat. "You are not that man anymore," she whispered. "You came back for me. You didn't freeze tonight." She moved closer, sliding her knees between his. The heat of the fire pressed against their backs, but the heat between them was stronger. "Do not tell me what you deserve, Eli. Let me decide." The moment stretched, tight as a bowstring. The air in the cabin seemed to vibrate. The fear of the storm, the adrenaline of the escape, the raw honesty of their confessions, it all catalyzed into a sudden, overwhelming need. Clara leaned forward. Eli leaned forward. Their lips met. It wasn't a tentative, shy kiss. It was hungry. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and smoke and survival. Clara pressed herself against him, a sob escaping her throat. She needed to feel him, to know he was real, to erase the memory of the ropes in the deputy's hands. Eli's arms went around her, pulling her in tight. For a moment, he lost control. He kissed her deeply, his hands tangling in her hair, his body reacting to the feel of her soft curves against his hardness. But then his hand brushed her side, near her ribs, and Clara flinched. A tiny, reflexive gasp. Eli froze. He pulled back instantly, his chest heaving. "Clara," he gasped, "are you sure?" Clara was trembling. The old panic was there, the shadow of Luke, the fear that passion always led to pain. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She was terrified. But she looked at Eli. She saw the concern in his eyes. He had stopped. He had felt her fear, and he had stopped. She reached out and gripped his shirt, pulling him back, but not for a kiss. She pulled him down until they were lying on the dusty floor, wrapped in the bedroll. "I'm afraid," she whispered, tears leaking from her eyes. "I'm afraid of my own body, but I do not want to stop." Eli pressed his forehead against hers. "We stop," he said firmly. "We stop right here. I am not going anywhere." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her firmly but without demand. He trapped her in a cage of safety. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "Just breathe," he whispered. "I have you." Clara clung to him. She buried her face in his neck, breathing in his scent. She begged him, in a whisper that was barely audible over the wind, "Keep holding me. Do not let go until the fear quiets." And he didn't. They lay there as the fire died down to embers, fully clothed, limbs entwined. It was not the night of passion the gossips in town would have imagined. It was something far more intimate. It was two broken people holding each other together while the world tried to tear them apart. And as Clara finally drifted into sleep, she realized that for the first time in her life, the arms around her were not a prison, but a shield. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the world scoured clean and blindingly white. The sun hammered down on the snow-covered peaks, creating a glare so harsh it forced the eyes shut. The silence of the high country was absolute, save for the occasional crack of a pine branch giving way under the weight of the ice. Eli Maddox and Clara Hayes stepped out of the line cabin into this frozen cathedral. The air was thin and sharp enough to cut the lungs. They stood on the ridge, squinting against the light, their breath pluming in the air. Eli walked to the edge of the drop-off, studying the valley below. He went still. Clara moved to stand beside him, wrapping the moth-eaten blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What is it?" Eli pointed a gloved hand toward the timberline far below. Dark shapes were moving against the white snow, riders moving slowly, tracking back and forth like hounds. "They found the deputy's horse," Eli said, his voice flat. "Now they are looking for us. They know we went up." Clara stared at the distant figures. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach, distinct from the freezing air. "They will not stop, will they?" "No," Eli said. "Not as long as Jeremiah Barlow has money to pay them. We can keep running. There are passes to the north. We could make it to the territories, maybe California, change our names, disappear." He turned to look at her, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Is that what you want? Clara, to live as a ghost?" Clara looked at the riders, then back at the cabin that had been their shelter and their confessional. She thought about the years of shrinking herself, of hiding her bruises, of letting the town write her story for her. She thought about the land her mother had left her. Not much, but hers. "I'm tired," she said softly. Eli nodded slowly. "I know. The trail is hard." "No," Clara said, her voice strengthening. "I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being a rumor. I'm tired of being a sin. If we run now, Jeremiah wins. He takes the land. He takes my name. He proves that I am exactly what he says I am. A guilty, loose woman who fled in the night." She turned to Eli, her dark eyes fierce. "I want my life back. Eli, I want to walk down the street and not look at the ground. I want my land legally protected." Eli looked at her for a long moment. He saw the steel in her spine, forged in the fires of her grief. "To go back is dangerous," he warned. "If we walk into Dustford, we are walking into a trap. They could hang me. They could lock you away." "I know," Clara said, "but I will not let them win without a fight. Will you stand with me?" Eli reached out and brushed a snowflake from her hair. His touch was gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she knew he was capable of. "I will stand with you," he said, "until the rope breaks." They did not ride straight into town. They rode with the caution of wolves entering a sheepfold. They descended the mountain on the far side, circling wide to reach the homestead of a woman Eli knew. Martha Vance was a widow who ran a small dry goods store on the edge of the valley. She was a hard woman, worn down by wind and work, with hands like gnarled roots and a shotgun she kept behind the counter. They arrived after dark. Eli knocked on the back door. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then one more. The door opened a crack. Martha peered out, a lantern held high. When she saw Eli's scar, her face softened just a fraction. "You look like death warmed over." "Maddox," she said, stepping back to let them in. They sat in her small kitchen, eating stew that tasted of sage and salvation. Martha listened as Clara spoke. She listened to the story of the alley, the forged papers, the flight into the snow. She did not interrupt. She watched Clara with sharp, intelligent eyes. "I heard Jeremiah Barlow in my store last week," Martha said, pouring coffee. "He was boasting to the sheriff. Said he would own that land and your soul before the month was out. Said a woman alone was like a calf separated from the herd, easy pickings." Clara's hand shook around her cup. "He said that?" "He did," Martha affirmed. "I have no love for the Barlows. They squeezed my husband on a grain deal years ago. Drove him to an early grave with the stress of it." She looked at Eli, then back to Clara. "If you are going to fight him, you need a witness. I will testify to what I heard. It is high time someone stood up to that man." The next piece of the puzzle was Silas Vane. Eli found him the next morning, hiding in the back room of the Dustford saloon, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey. The lawyer looked wretched, his suit stained, his eyes bloodshot. When Eli stepped into the room, Vane nearly fell out of his chair. "Please, Mr. Maddox," he stammered. "I had no choice. Jeremiah threatened to ruin me." Eli closed the door and leaned against it. "You have a choice now. Silas, we are going to court today. You are going to bring the papers Jeremiah made you draft, and you are going to tell the truth." Vane swallowed hard. "He will kill me." Eli rested his hand on the butt of his pistol. "And I am already here." Vane looked at the cold certainty in Eli's eyes. He nodded, wiping sweat from his upper lip. "I will get the papers." The ride into Dustford was quiet. The air was heavy, charged with the static of an approaching storm, though the sky was clear. Clara and Eli rode side by side. The landscape seemed to mirror the stakes, jagged rocks that could cut a horse to ribbons, sudden drop-offs into nothingness, narrow trails where one wrong step meant disaster. The land itself was testing them. As they neared the edge of town, Eli reached out and covered Clara's hand with his own. His grip was warm and solid. "Head up." "Clara," he said softly, "do not let them see you bleed." Clara squeezed his hand, then straightened her back. She adjusted her bonnet, wiped the dust from her coat, and rode forward. Jeremiah had not wasted time. When they rode down the main street toward the courthouse, a crowd had already gathered. News of the fugitive widow's return had spread like wildfire. Men stood on porches, chewing tobacco and watching with dark amusement. Women peered from windows, their faces tight with judgment. They tied their horses at the rail. The courthouse was a brick building that smelled of old paper and hypocrisy. The courtroom doors were open, and the town had packed the benches to watch Clara's humiliation. Jeremiah Barlow sat at the front table, looking like a king on his throne. The sheriff sat beside him, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. The preacher was there, clutching a Bible like a weapon. When Clara and Eli walked down the aisle, a murmur ran through the room. It was a sound of scandal and excitement. The judge, a man with a face like a dried apple, banged his gavel. "Order," the judge barked. "Bring the accused forward." Clara stood before the bench. She felt small, stripped naked by the hundreds of eyes boring into her back. But she felt Eli standing just behind her, a silent, dangerous shadow, and it gave her the strength to breathe. "Clara Hayes," the judge read from a document. "You are petitioned here on grounds of moral depravity, theft, and mental incompetence, Mr. Barlow claims you have abandoned your station, taken up with a known criminal, and attempted to defraud his family. How do you answer?" "I answer with the truth." "Your Honor," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. Jeremiah stood up. "The truth. This woman is a harlot. Judge, she seduced this half-breed to do her dirty work. She was responsible for the death of my son, Luke, a hero of this town. She drove him to his grave with her wicked ways, and now she tries to steal family land to pay for her sins." The room buzzed. The accusation of murder hung in the air like smoke. Silas Vane stepped forward. His hands were trembling, but he laid a stack of papers on the judge's bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking. "These are the documents, mister. Barlow asked me to prepare. They are forgeries." Jeremiah turned purple. "You drunkard! I will have you disbarred." Vane flinched but kept talking. He copied Mrs. Hayes's signature from an old bill of sale. He dictated the statements regarding her mental state. "There isn't a doctor in this territory who has examined her. It is all lies." The judge picked up the papers, his eyebrows drawing together. Then Martha Vance stood up from the back of the room. "I heard him too. Judge!" The crowd turned. Martha marched down the aisle, her boots loud on the floorboards. "I heard Jeremiah Barlow bragging in my store. He said he would crush her. He said he would take the land because it was worth money to the railroad. And he didn't care who he had to hurt to get it." Jeremiah slammed his hand on the table. "This is a conspiracy of whores and outlaws." Clara stepped forward. She looked at Jeremiah. Then she turned to face the room. She looked at the faces of the people who had shunned her, the women who had whispered, the men who had stared. "I am not a whore," she said, "and I am not mad. I was a wife." The room went quiet. "I was a wife to a man who beat me," Clara said. Her voice gained strength, ringing off the rafters. "I hid the bruises under my dresses. I smiled when he told me to smile. I prayed for him to change." She looked at the preacher. "You told me to be obedient, Reverend. You told me it was my duty to bear his temper. So I bore it." She took a deep breath. "The night Luke died, he was drunk. He chased me out to the ridge. He was going to kill me. I saw it in his eyes. He slipped on the wet rocks." She paused. The silence was absolute. "I did not push him," she said, "but I watched him fall. And God help me, I wanted him to fall. I wanted it to be over." A gasp rippled through the room. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. "Does that make me a murderer?" Clara asked, tears streaming down her face. "Or does it make me a woman who wanted to live?" For a moment, no one moved. The raw, bleeding honesty of her words had cracked the shell of their prejudice. Some of the women were crying quietly, recognizing the shadow of their own secret pains in Clara's story. The preacher stood up, his face red. "You confess to desiring his death. You confess to sinful lust for this savage standing behind you. You are a vessel of corruption." Clara looked at him. "Wanting to be held with kindness is not a sin," she said. "Men like you have sinned far more by using God as a whip to keep us on our knees." Eli stepped up beside her. He did not speak. He just stood there, his hand resting on his gun belt, a physical wall between Clara and the hate. Jeremiah saw the room turning. He saw the judge looking at the forged papers with disgust. He saw his power slipping away like water through a sieve. "Arrest him!" Jeremiah screamed, pointing at Eli. "He is an outlaw. He kidnapped her. Sheriff, do your duty." The sheriff hesitated, but a man sitting in the front row, a hired gun with dead eyes, did not. He stood up and drew his pistol. "Gun!" Eli shouted, shoving Clara to the floor. Chaos erupted. The hired gun fired. The bullet tore through Eli's coat, grazing his side. Eli drew his peacemaker with a speed that blurred the eye. He returned fire, his shot shattering the man's shoulder and sending him spinning into the benches. The courtroom exploded into screaming panic. People scrambled for the exits. Outside, in the street, more shots rang out. Jeremiah's ranch hands were firing at the building. Eli grabbed Clara and dragged her behind the heavy oak table. "Stay down." He popped up, firing 2 shots through the open window to keep the men outside at bay. Suddenly, a young man ran into the street. It was a ranch hand named Toby, a boy who had once carried Clara's groceries and had looked at her with kindness. He was shouting at Jeremiah's men to stop. "Do not shoot," Toby yelled. "She is innocent." A shot rang out from the alley. Jeremiah's foreman. Toby jerked. He looked down at his chest, a look of profound surprise on his face. He collapsed into the dust of the street, blood pooling around him. The shooting stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. The townspeople, spilling out of the courthouse, stared at the body of the boy. He was one of their own. He was innocent. And he was dead because Jeremiah Barlow wanted a piece of land. Jeremiah stood on the courthouse steps, his face pale. He looked at the body, then at the crowd. He saw the shift in their eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, judging anger. The judge walked out onto the steps. He looked at the dead boy, then at Jeremiah. "Sheriff," the judge said, his voice shaking with rage, "take Mr. Barlow into custody, and if you do not, I will have the federal marshal here by the end of the week to arrest you both." The sheriff, seeing the mood of the crowd, slowly took the badge off his vest. He did not arrest Jeremiah, but he did not defend him either. He walked away. The judge turned to Clara, who was standing in the doorway, supported by Eli. "The petition is dismissed," the judge said loudly. "The papers are invalid. The land belongs to Mrs. Hayes." He looked at Eli. "You defended this courthouse, Mr. Maddox, so I will not charge you for the shooting inside. But hear me well. You are a dangerous element. If there is another incident, if you draw that iron in my town again, you will hang." The sun was setting by the time the undertaker came for Toby. Clara knelt in the dirt beside the boy's body. She did not care about the blood ruining her dress. She felt a crushing weight of guilt. "He was just a boy," she whispered. "He died because of me." Eli knelt beside her. He was pressing a handkerchief to his side, where the bullet had cut a deep furrow across his ribs. His face was gray with pain and exhaustion. "He died because men like Barlow think they own the world," Eli said. He reached out and touched Clara's shoulder. "Freedom costs. Clara, it always costs. Sometimes it costs blood. You cannot carry the guilt for the sins of other men." Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were dry now, burned out by too much grief, but she saw the truth in his face. The West was not a fairy tale. It was a place where you fought for every inch of ground, and sometimes good people did not make it home. She stood up. She looked at the townspeople lingering in the street. Some still whispered, pointing at Eli with fear and suspicion. They would always whisper. They would always say she was cursed. But others, Martha Vance, the blacksmith, a few of the women, looked at her differently. They met her eyes. They nodded. They saw her scars now, and they respected the woman who had survived them. Clara took Eli's arm. "Let us go home," she said. "Where?" Eli asked. "To my land," she said. "To the only place that is ours." They walked down the street toward the livery stable, leaving the dead boy and the ruined tycoon behind them. They walked slowly, Eli limping slightly, Clara holding him up. They were battered, bleeding, and exhausted. But they were walking away, and they were walking together. The victory at the courthouse did not bring the peace that the storybooks promised. It brought a silence that was heavy and smelling of copper, and it brought the fever. The bullet that had grazed Eli Maddox's side during the chaos had dug a furrow across his ribs, tearing through the heavy canvas of his coat and the flannel shirt beneath. In the adrenaline of the fight and the ride to the livery, he had ignored it. But the body keeps a tally that the mind cannot override. By the time they reached the sanctuary of Martha Vance's back room, the adrenaline had drained away, leaving Eli gray-faced and shivering, his skin burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the desert sun. The local doctor was a man who drank his own rubbing alcohol and was firmly in Jeremiah Barlow's pocket. Clara refused to let him near Eli. Instead, she took charge of the small room behind Martha's store, a space filled with sacks of flour and the dry, dusty scent of dried herbs. She boiled water on the cast-iron stove until the room was stifling. She tore strips from her own petticoats to make bandages, and then, with hands that trembled only until they touched his skin, she began to wash the blood away. Eli was drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering in a mix of English and Apache. He lay on the narrow cot, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. Clara carefully peeled back the blood-stiffened fabric of his shirt. When she exposed his torso, she stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. The fresh wound was angry and red, a jagged line of torn flesh. but it was lost in a map of violence that covered his chest and back. There were the puckered, circular scars of old bullet wounds. There were thin, white lines where knives had opened him up. There were burns and bruises that had faded into the leather of his skin. Every inch of him was a story of pain, a testament to a life spent standing between the world and its cruelty. Clara dipped the sponge into the basin. The water turned pink. She touched the sponge to his skin, tracing the lines of his history. With Luke, scars had been something to hide. They were marks of shame, evidence of her failure to be a good wife. But looking at Eli, seeing the endurance carved into his very flesh, Clara felt a surge of emotion that terrified her. It was not pity. It was a fierce, protective desire. She wanted to press her mouth to those scars. She wanted to wrap herself around him and shield him from ever taking another mark. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were glassy, unfocused. "Clara," he rasped. His voice was like dry leaves. "I am here," Clara whispered, wringing out the sponge. "I am right here." "Go," he muttered, turning his head restlessly against the pillow. "Shadows." "They are coming. There are no shadows here," she said, though she felt them pressing against the window panes. "Just you and me." She stayed by his side for 3 days and 3 nights. She slept in a chair, waking at every shift in his breathing. She forced willow bark tea between his lips to break the fever. She fought the infection with the same stubbornness she had used to fight Jeremiah Barlow. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the wind howled around the corners of the building, fear gnawed at her. She realized how fragile this victory was. They had won in court, yes, but Eli was mortal. He was flesh and blood, and he could be broken. The thought of losing him now, just when she had found the courage to reach for him, was a cold hollow in her chest that no fire could fill. On the 4th morning, while Eli slept a deep, restorative sleep, Clara stepped out the back door of the store. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders and looked out over the valley. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape. To the west, the purple mountains rose like jagged teeth against the icy blue sky. Below, the dry riverbed wound through the sagebrush like a scar. It was a land of drought and dust, of wind that could strip the paint off a house in a season. Clara imagined her mother's land, that patch of earth she had fought so hard to reclaim. She pictured herself there, alone. She imagined building a cabin by herself, dragging the logs. She imagined facing a winter storm with no one to help secure the shutters. She imagined the silence of the evenings, sitting by a fire with no other voice to break the quiet, no other heart beating in the room. She had told herself for years that freedom meant being alone. She had thought that safety meant having no one to answer to, but looking out at that vast, empty horizon, Clara felt a bleakness that frightened her more than Jeremiah ever had. Jeremiah was a man she could fight. This loneliness was a ghost she could not shoot. She realized then that survival was not enough. A life of merely not being hurt was not a life. It was just an existence. The door creaked behind her. Martha stood there, wiping her hands on her apron. "He is asking for you," Martha said softly. "The fever is broken." Clara turned, her heart leaping. She hurried back inside. Eli was sitting up, leaning against the wall. He looked gaunt, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut, but his eyes were clear. The dark fire was back in them, but it was dim, banked down by exhaustion and something else. Resignation. "Clara," he said. She went to him, instinctively reaching out to touch his forehead. His skin was cool. "You are back," she breathed, a smile trembling on her lips. Eli caught her hand. He held it for a moment, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Then he gently let it go. "We need to talk," he said. Clara pulled the chair close. "We can talk later. You need to eat. You need strength. I have enough strength to say this," Eli said. He looked past her, at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight. "When I can ride, I'm going to move on." Clara froze. The room seemed to tilt. Move on. Where? West. Arizona. Maybe. There is work for a man who knows the trails. But the land, Clara stammered. We talked about the land. Eli shook his head. You have the land. Clara, it is yours. The judge signed the papers. You are safe now. Jeremiah is broken. You can hire decent men to build your house. You can start over. Why? Clara whispered. The single word carried the weight of the last week. Because you deserve a life that is not stained by me, Eli said, his voice rough. Look at me. Clara, I am a half-breed gunman with a price on my head in 3 counties. The town tolerates me now because I saved you, but that will not last. If I stay, the whispers will never stop. You will never be respectable. You will always be the woman who lies with the savage. He looked at her then, and the pain in his eyes was naked. I want you to have a chance. Clara, a real chance. To find a man who can walk you into church on Sunday without the whole town spitting. A man who does not wake up screaming from nightmares of blood. Clara stared at him. She saw his logic. It was the same cruel, iron-hard logic he had used in Dustford. He was trying to save her from himself. He was cutting his own heart out to give her a clean slate. She stood up slowly. I see, she said. Her voice was flat. She turned and walked out of the room before he could see the tears start to fall. Clara found herself in Martha's small kitchen. It was a cluttered, cozy space, smelling of yeast and coffee. She gripped the edge of the wash basin, staring at her reflection in the copper kettle on the stove. The face that looked back at her was distorted by the curve of the metal, but she recognized the eyes. They were not the eyes of the terrified girl who had cowered in the boarding house. They were the eyes of a woman who had crossed a desert, who had stood up in a courtroom and spoken her shame aloud, who had held a dying man and promised to keep living. She was at a fork in the road. One path led to the life Eli wanted for her, a respectable life. She could sell the land or hire men to work it. She could eventually marry a shopkeeper or a rancher, someone safe, someone boring. Someone who would never know the darkness she carried because she would never show it to him. She would be safe, she would be accepted, and she would be cold for the rest of her life. The other path led into the unknown. It led to a man with scars on his soul and blood on his hands. It led to gossip and exclusion. It led to hard work and danger. But it also led to the memory of his arms around her in the storm. It led to the way he looked at her, not as a possession, but as an equal. She remembered the night in the line cabin. She remembered his restraint. He could have taken anything he wanted. He could have used her fear to get what he needed, but he hadn't. He had held her trembling body and waited. He had given her the power of choice. Luke had been respectable. Luke had been a sheriff, a church deacon, a white man with a good name, and Luke had made her wish for death. Eli was a savage, an outcast, a killer, and Eli had made her want to live. Clara looked at her reflection and straightened her spine. For the first time in her life, she did not feel shame at the thought of her desire. She felt pride. She wanted him. She wanted the heat of him, the strength of him, the broken parts of him that matched the broken parts of her. She wiped her face. She was done letting men decide what was best for her, even Eli. 2 days later, Eli was strong enough to sit a horse. He was stiff and his face was pale, but he insisted he was ready. We will ride to your land, he said. I want to see you settled before I go. They rode out of the valley, heading toward the foothills where Clara's mother's claim lay. It was a long ride, winding through canyons and up onto a high plateau. When they finally crested the ridge, Clara pulled her horse to a stop. There it was. It was not a lush garden. It was harsh country. Scrub brush and twisted junipers clung to the rocky soil. The wind scoured the earth, but there was a small spring trickling between 2 boulders, creating a ribbon of green grass. And the view stretched for 50 miles, a vast, open expanse of freedom. It is beautiful, Clara whispered. Eli rode up beside her. He looked at the land with a rancher's eye. There is good water. he said, pointing. You build the house there, in the lee of that overhang. It will block the north wind. You put the corrals down by the creek, but on the high ground so they do not wash out in a flash flood. He turned his horse, gesturing. That flat stretch there, that is good for winter grazing. And the timber up that slope, you can cut enough wood to build a solid cabin. A good roof, something that will last. He was describing a future. He was building a home with his words. But he was speaking as if he would not be there to drive the nails. Come, he said. I will show you where to set the camp for tonight. They rode down to the spring. Eli moved with a stiff efficiency. Setting up a simple camp, he watered the horses, gathered wood, and started a fire. Then, he began to saddle his horse again. Clara was unpacking the food. She stopped. What are you doing? Eli tightened the cinch. He did not look at her. I told you, Clara, I wanted to see you safe. You are here. You have the papers. You know where to build. He adjusted the stirrup leather. His movements jerky. I will ride back to Dustford. Pick up my gear. Then head south. It is best to do it quick. Like pulling a tooth. He grabbed the pommel to mount up. Eli. No. Clara dropped the sack of coffee. She walked toward him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Harder than it had in the courtroom. This was the terrifying part. This was the moment she had to strip herself bare. Eli stopped. He looked at her over the saddle. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Clara, do not make this harder. I am not making it hard, Clara said, her voice shaking. I am making it true. She stepped in front of the horse. She grabbed the bridle, preventing him from turning the animal. She looked up at him, tears swimming in her eyes, but her chin held high. You say you are leaving for me, she said. You say I need safety. You say I need a man the town respects. She took a step closer, until she was standing right by his boot. I had safety. Eli, I had a house with a roof. I had a husband the town respected. And it was a hell you cannot imagine. I would rather sleep in the dirt with you than in a feather bed with a man who does not know me. Clara, Eli groaned, looking away toward the horizon. You do not know what you are asking. I am nothing but scars and mistakes. I have ghosts that will never leave me. I have ghosts too, Clara cried. She reached up and grabbed his gloved hand where it rested on his thigh. We all have ghosts, Eli. The question is, do we face them alone? She stripped the glove from his hand. She pressed his rough, scarred palm against her cheek. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. I love you, she whispered. Eli went still as stone. I love you, she repeated, the words rushing out now. When I am with you, I do not hear Luke's voice. I do not feel the town watching me. I feel safe, not the safety of a cage, but the safety of a shield. She opened her eyes and looked straight into his. I am scared. Eli, I am scared of the gossip. I am scared of the winter. I am scared of how much I want you, but I am more scared of watching you ride away. If you leave me here, if you leave me alone in this silence, you are not saving me. You are killing the best part of me. Eli looked down at her. He saw the absolute, terrifying vulnerability in her face. He saw a woman who was offering him everything, her name, her body, her future, knowing exactly what it would cost her. He tried to argue one last time. Clara cut him off. She let go of his hand and stepped back, opening her arms wide. Hold me like you mean it. Eli, she whispered, or let me go forever. The silence stretched. The wind sighed through the junipers. The horse shifted its weight, crunching the gravel. Eli looked at the open trail leading south. It was the easy way. It was the way of the loner, the drifter, the man who owed nothing to anyone. Then he looked at Clara, with a sound like a breaking dam. Eli slipped his foot from the stirrup. He swung down from the saddle. He didn't even bother to drop the reins. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He didn't speak. He didn't apologize. He reached out and pulled her into his arms with a force that knocked the breath out of her. He held her. He held her like a drowning man clutching a lifeline. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. inhaling the scent of her skin, the dust, and the wind. His arms wrapped around her back, crushing her against him, dissolving the space between their bodies. Clara gasped, a sound half sob, half laugh. She threw her arms around his neck, digging her fingers into his coat. She pressed herself against him, feeling the hard wall of his chest, the heat of him, the undeniable reality of him. Eli lifted his head and found her mouth. The kiss was not gentle. It was fierce. It was a reclaiming. It was an answer to every doubt, every fear, every whisper of shame. It was deep and lingering, tasting of salt and promise. Clara melted into him. The desire that she had feared for so long surged up, hot and bright. But this time there was no panic. There was no shadow of Luke. There was only Eli. There was only this man who had crossed a desert for her, who had bled for her, and who was now choosing her. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Eli rested his forehead against hers. His hands framed her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "I am not going anywhere," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. I am staying right here." Clara laughed through her tears. "Good, because we have a fence to build." They sat by the fire that night, not as travelers, but as partners. They talked late into the night. They talked about practical things, the concrete details of survival that kept the romance grounded in the earth. "We will need to buy seed in Dustford," Eli said, poking the fire. "Wheat, maybe. And we need to fix the spring box before the first freeze." "I can sell my mother's jewelry," Clara said. "It will buy us a plow and a milk cow. And fencing," Eli added. "We need to fence the garden tight. The deer up here are thieves." They spoke of the future not as a dream, but as a plan. And then Clara shifted closer to him, wrapping the blanket around both of them. "Eli," she said softly, "there is something else." "What?" "This land. It is far from town. It is quiet." "Yes, there are other women," Clara said, looking into the flames. "Women like I was. Women who have nowhere to go when the world turns cruel. Women who are hiding bruises." Eli looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I want this place to be a refuge." Clara said, "I want to leave the gate unlatched. If a woman comes here running, I want us to take her in. I want us to give her what you gave me, a chance to breathe." Eli smiled. It was a slow, rare smile that lit up his dark face. "A refuge for the broken." He said, "I like that. It is a good way to thumb our noses at the Barlows of the world." The seasons turned. The winter was hard, burying the plateau in snow, but the cabin held. The spring came with a riot of wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and lupine painting the slopes in red and purple. Months later, the ranch was no longer just an idea. It was a scar on the land that was healing into a home. The cabin was rough-hewn timber, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. A sturdy corral held 3 horses and a milk cow. The sound of a hammer striking nails rang out in the crisp air as Eli repaired the roof of the shed. It was late afternoon when a rider appeared on the ridge. Clara was in the garden, turning the earth. She stood up, shielding her eyes. The rider was a woman. She was riding a mule that looked half-starved. As she came closer, Clara saw the slump of her shoulders, the way she clutched a small bundle to her chest. The woman stopped at the gate. She looked at Clara with wide, frightened eyes. A dark purple bruise blossomed on her cheekbone. I heard there was a place," the woman stammered. "In town. They whispered about a widow and a cowboy. They said you turned no one away." Clara dropped her hoe. She walked to the gate and opened it wide. "You heard right." Clara said, "Get down. The coffee is hot." Eli came around the corner of the cabin, his hammer in his hand. He looked at the woman, saw the bruise, saw the fear. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand payment. He simply nodded and reached for the mule's bridle to lead it to water. "Welcome home," Eli said. That evening, after the stranger was fed and sleeping in the loft, Clara and Eli sat on the porch. The sun had gone down, leaving the sky a deep, bruised indigo. The first stars were burning cold and white above them. The desert wind howled through the canyon, a lonely, ancient sound. They sat on a bench Eli had built. wrapped in a shared buffalo robe. Clara leaned back into Eli's chest. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her back. It was the strongest sound in the world. She looked out at the dark shape of the mountains. The shadows were still there. They always would be. The town still whispered. Jeremiah Barlow still sat on his money in the valley, nursing his hate. The world was still a hard, dangerous place. But Clara was no longer trembling. She reached up and covered Eli's hands where they rested across her stomach. His arms tightened around her instantly. An automatic, fierce response. "Are you afraid?" Eli whispered, his chin resting on her hair. Clara listened to the wind. She listened to the coyote calling in the distance. She listened to the silence of her own soul and found it peaceful. "No," she whispered back. "I'm not afraid of tomorrow anymore." She turned her head to look at him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "As long as you keep holding me like you mean it." Eli smiled, and he pulled her closer, anchoring her against the night. "I reckon I can do that," he said, and in the vast, quiet dark of the American West, two broken people held on to each other, and it was enough. Thank you for journeying with me down this dusty trail to Ash Hollow. It has been a pleasure to spin this yarn of Clara and Eli, and to find a little light in the shadows of the old frontier. I would be mighty obliged if you would tip your hat in the comments and let me know where you are listening from tonight. It is always a joy to know how far the campfire light reaches. If you have a hankering for more tales of grit, gunpowder, and romance under the western stars, please do subscribe to From Wild West. I invite you to share your thoughts on the story in English. Did Clara make the right choice? Did Eli find his redemption? I look forward to hearing from you. Until we meet again on the trail.